Now, the third major mistake is you just don't have a strategy in place to pass your assets. And what we need to try to do is figure out who you are and what your goals are and make sure that your estate plan reflects that. You know, Tim mentioned earlier something called a transfer on death account. And that's a good tool, and it might be right for you in some situations. But if you're mom and dad and you have your Edward Jones account transferred to your oldest son under a transfer on death account, assuming that he will share it equally with the other siblings, and when you go, it just so happens that your son has a child who's medically stressed, that is not getting their bills paid by insurance coverage, what do you think is going to happen to that money? You know, you're going to disinherit your other children, and of course the more money involved, the more problems that could develop. People do the same thing with joint tenancies. I don't need a will because my wife and I are on the deed together to our home, and that's pretty much all we have. Well, that's great because it does transfer property to your spouse, but when the second spouse death comes around, where does it go and how does it get there? So there are stopgap ways to do planning, but many times they're haphazard and they don't address all the questions that you really should be thinking about. We mentioned that probate can take about a year in time, but what we didn't mention earlier, that for the legal fees, the executor fees, the appraisal costs, the court filing fees, the register guard notification fees, in Lane County it runs anywhere from 2 to 3% of the estate in terms of financial costs to pay for the probate on top of the year administration. And that may not sound like much by way of percentage, but on a larger estate it comes out to tens upon tens of thousands of dollars. And the other problem with probate that people really have trouble with is that it extends the grieving period. Can you imagine losing a dear loved one and only to be peppered with legal documents month in and month out and court appearances and things for a year or more period of time? It makes it difficult every time you deal with that legal paper to deal with the high esteem and the closeness you felt to that loved one. It tends to cheapen and bring down that relationship. So that's another objective we want to try to avoid there. Now let me tell you a little bit more about living trusts. A living trust can be thought of as basically a simple box. You put your assets into this box by retitling them into the name of the trust. Once the assets are in the trustee makes all decisions on managing them. The trustee will buy assets, sell assets, collect income, pay bills. When you become, and if you become incapacitated, as I mentioned, a successor trustee you've designated in advance will step in and continue to bounce the ball while you're sick without missing a beat. No court intervention, no legal intervention. The bills will be paid. You might have to show your certificate of trust to the bank or to Tim or to other financial people, but you really will keep rolling along. Now, the beauty of the trust really blossoms when you pass away, because at that point in time, you technically, legally die penniless. All your assets have been transferred into the trust. The title to your home now reads John and Mary Doe, comma, trustees, the Doe Family Trust. It doesn't read just John and Mary Doe individually or jointly. Same thing with your securities account and your other assets. So there's nothing to probate because you didn't have any assets when you passed away. What does happen? Again, your successor trustee steps in, and usually that's a spouse, first and foremost. But if your spouse is already predeceased or you don't have a spouse, then whoever you've designated will continue to honor the terms of the trust without any probate. Typically, I could administer a trust in 30 to 45 days for $1,000 or $2,000, as opposed to a 12 to 18 month probate costing $10,000 or more. There's a tremendous difference, and the timing is really important too. It's so much quicker.